Hello AP Bio Nerds, and welcome to our video on Intro to Cellular Respiration. I feel like this video is important because in the next series of videos we're going to be looking really intensely and very minutely at some incredible details of this process. So when we're in the biochemistry of it all and you're like, why am I learning this? It's important to come back and realize the applications of all of this energetic knowledge. So we are going to look at cellular respiration, and cellular respiration in a nutshell is just how our body uses food to make energy. And this is done at a cellular level. So every move you make, every thought you have comes from your body doing this process in each and every cell. So this allows us to be able to be awesome bear cats and play football, jump over hurdles, run long distances like Aiden Farrell, and even have something really simple like a thought, or to be able to beat our heart or to digest our food. All of these processes require energy, and we need cellular respiration to work properly in order for that energy to be harvested. And when we look at cellular respiration, we really have two different types. The first type is a long, sustained type, and this type is called aerobic respiration. And this is what a marathon runner does. A marathon runner is able to use oxygen in their exercising and be able to have a long, sustained energy output. That's different from anaerobic respiration. And anaerobic respiration is an important process that our body uses when we need to have really intense, but really short, because it can't actually last that long, outputs of energy. And that's like what a sprinter would use. I kind of think of anaerobic respiration as nitros on a super souped up car. So nitros allow your car to go really quick for a really short amount of time, so we can tap into that energy and boost out really fast. However, once the nitros are empty, then we don't have the ability to use that speed, and we reduce down to normal energy output levels. When we're looking at aerobic respiration, it's a circular process with the partner of autotrophs. So the respiration between heterotrophs and autotrophs are basically mirror images of each other. So we have plants, algae, and many bacteria that use the process of photosynthesis. So this would represent photosynthesis. And that photosynthesis produces not only oxygen, but also the organic compounds in which we eat. Everything you eat always comes from photosynthesis. Even if you eat meat, that meat came from an animal that used photosynthesis to build its mass. So we have photosynthesis giving us not only oxygen, but also food energy. And for the purposes of when we study cellular respiration, we're always going to look at that as glucose, C6H12O6. So these are organic compounds and oxygen that our bodies then can use to break down. And the whole reason we want it to break down is to make cellular energy, ATP. So the organisms in the world that do that are us, right? Humans, animals, fungi are also going to be using cellular respiration. Insects, many bacteria, fish, etc. Basically everything except all heterotrophs are going to be using this process. And our waste products are going to be water and carbon dioxide, which are the products that are needed to jumpstart photosynthesis. So it's this one beautiful, perfect cycle that happens in our world between autotrophs and heterotrophs. Now let's look at the equation for cellular respiration. Our equation for cellular respiration is glucose right here, and this is what we get from food. I put my favorite food, Brussels sprouts. So when we eat food, our body intakes it and breaks it down into this molecule that's really important to use. Now, our body has other metabolic pathways using lipids and proteins. However, glucose, the pathway of a carbohydrate, glucose, is going to be the one that we study. So then we get oxygen from a plant. And here's our reaction, and our waste products are CO2, which we breathe out, and H2O, which we breathe out as well. That's why when you breathe onto a piece of glass, when you clean your glasses, you get some water vapor out there. And the whole point of this process is to make ATP, and that allows us to do important things like have thoughts and beat our heart and take a step and rock out at a concert, right? So it's kind of interesting to think about these hydrogen atoms that you are breathing out came from the food you ate. So depending on your metabolic rate, you could be breathing out right now your dinner from last night, or you could breathing out right now your breakfast from yesterday, or your coffee from this morning. So it's kind of interesting to think that these atoms are deconstructed and reconstructed, and then in that process giving us ATP. So this is a big, large outline of the process of cellular respiration. We start with our friend the glucose here, and then glucose goes through this process called glycolysis. Glycolysis needs 2 ATP to happen, and our next video is kind of glycolysis in detail. And glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm of the cell. So once glycolysis has occurred, the whole point of glycolysis is to give us pyruvate. So it actually gives us 2 pyruvate for 1 glycolysis. And once we have pyruvate, our cell kind of determines, yes, if there's oxygen present, then it's going to go through this long process that includes a big production of ATP. So we have the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, and that gives us 36 ATP, and that is with oxygen present. Now, without oxygen present, we go through a process called fermentation. And fermentation is a type of respiration. It still gives us energy. It only gives us 2 ATP, and that is actually the ATP that is made from glycolysis. And depending on what type of creature you are, your fermentation process, the products are either lactic acid or ethanol, alcohol. So when we look at fermentation, actually a lot of wonderful things in life come from fermentation, like bread and cheese and sauerkraut and beer and wine. So this is the process of using yeast, which goes through alcoholic fermentation, and bacteria, microorganisms, which go through lactic acid fermentation to make our cheese. This is sauerkraut. I've actually never had sauerkraut. I don't know if it's good, but it's basically fermented cabbage. So we can use the processes of these microorganisms, yeasts, and some bacteria to give us our foods. So even yogurt, lots of milk products are gone through fermentation through using bacteria. So when we look at who does what, there we go. So when we look at who does what, so in terms of fermentation, so this is, in terms of fermentation, humans, animals, us, we go through a process called lactic acid fermentation. And this process is actually what makes your muscles sore when you work out. So when you do high intensity workouts that are not these like long cardio workouts like going on a run, you might notice if you go on a 5-mile run, you're going to be a lot less sore than if you did sprint intervals for 20 minutes. So that's because your body is using an anaerobic process to harvest that energy, and the byproduct is lactic acid fermentation. And this is what makes our muscles sore. Now, our bodies can only do this for a certain amount of time, and so we tend to only be able to exert this amount of energy for a limited amount of time. And that's why actually in track, the 400 is one of the hardest races to run, because at about, we can do this high intensity for about a minute before we die out, or before we get, I call it booty cramp, or your muscles start to lock up because they're cramping. They're not able to get that oxygen to produce that energy needed to do the task that you're doing. And then if we look at certain microorganisms, some bacteria do lactic acid fermentation and some do alcoholic fermentation. But the superstar in alcoholic fermentation is yeast. And yeast, it takes glucose and breaks it down in glycolysis, and the byproduct is typically ethanol. And this is used to make things like bread and beer and wine. So in review, we have the whole point of cellular respiration is to release energy stored in food. So not only can we work out and have energy to like climb mountains, but also to have energy to do simple things in our body like beat your heart or take a breath. The main goal of cellular respiration is to produce ATP. We have two types of cellular respiration. We have anaerobic, and anaerobic is kind of like turbo energy for a short period of time. A lot of times this is called fermentation. So maybe if you're a sprinter and you're going out on the track and you're like, oh, I'm going to go do some fermentation exercise. In humans, we do lactic acid fermentation. And yeasts and some microorganisms do alcoholic fermentation. So when you think of anaerobic respiration, think of a sprinter, somebody that harvests energy and outputs it in a really high intensity, short amount of time. But we can't do that forever. Our body needs oxygen in order to produce more ATP to sustain that. Then we have aerobic respiration, which, yes, it uses oxygen. It produces more ATP, 36 to be exact. Anaerobic produces 2. And this is akin to a marathon runner who is able to have controlled, long, sustained movement and produce enough ATP to sustain that activity with oxygen present. And that is our intro to cellular respiration. Have a good day.